now going straight into our next section, knowledge.
Who produces knowledge?
For whom?
Who's listening?
Who is amplified?
Who's validated?
And who is silenced?
Forgotten?
Or rendered invisible?
Hey, we already did this earlier today.
I know, but these are crucial questions worth repeating.
All right. Did you know that 15% of the entire historical human experience belongs to the people who are alive right now?
How do you mean?
There are so many of us right now that in this year, 2020, 15% of the entire historical human population is alive, breathing, experiencing, and producing knowledge.
That perspective is insane. That also means that the creation,
dissemination,
and consumption of information
has reached unprecedented levels.
With political and economic powers exerting huge influence on the scope and content of the circulating information, we are creating a widening gap between content and facts and information providers and consumers.
This section on knowledge critically engages with the production and distribution of knowledge. We will begin with a video message by the philosopher Isabelle Stengers, who is sharing with us her doubts about the driving the human and her plea for earthly commitments.
Stengers' call to side with some ways of living and dying and not others will be immediately followed by a panel discussion with Indy, Johar and Sarat Maharaj, moderated by Michael Kaethler.
A quick reminder, it is my turn to join the Q&A of the panel discussion, to pass you questions from our Telegram group to the panelists.
Right. So, Moritz, do you have Stengers' earthly commitments for us?
If that's what you want, you shall have it.
That would be great.
Je voudrais dire d'abord ma perplexité. Comment intervenir au sein d'une rencontre dont le titre est aussi obscur et énigmatique que Driving the Human? J'ai beaucoup hésité. Pour moi, la seule manière de penser sans désespoir la situation où nous sommes, c'est de maintenir l'idée que nous ne savons pas ce dont ceux que nous nommons humains sont capables et peuvent se rendre capables. Parlant du nous qui ne sait pas, je parle avant tout de celles et ceux qui ont cru qu'ils savaient, qu'ils pouvaient définir l'aventure humaine et qui découvrent aujourd'hui que leur imagination est en panne. Je ne parle pas des peuples de la Terre qui ont subi les désastres causés par cette marche en avant inexorable que nous avons appelée progrès. Il me semble alors que le terme drive dans Driving the Human pourrait bien convenir à ce qui s'est emparé de ces humains particuliers que nous sommes, la manière dont ils ont été possédés, rendus insensibles aux ravages aussi bien écologiques que culturels, sociaux et spirituels qu'ils commettaient au nom du progrès. Pour moi, la question n'est pas que nous reconnaissions notre culpabilité. La culpabilité ne permet pas de penser ce que nous avons détruit autrement que comme victimes, c'est-à-dire nous met au centre de la scène, comme toujours. Gilles Deleuze a proposé que la honte, au contraire de la culpabilité, peut, elle, mettre en mouvement la pensée. Elle peut ouvrir autre chose qu'à nous-mêmes. Donna Haraway, elle, a proposé d'éviter la binarité innocent-coupable pour penser ce qu'elle appelle non-innocence. Ce sont ces deux penseurs qui vont me guider dans cette intervention. Nous n'avons pas à reconnaître que ce que nous avons honoré, les pratiques des sciences, de l'art, de la philosophie, les inventions techniques, les idées d'émancipation ou l'affirmation des droits humains sont coupables. Mais nous ne pouvons pas les penser comme innocentes. Nous avons à penser avec la honte qui peut inspirer la manière dont elles se sont associées avec l'évidence de l'exceptionnalité de l'homme blanc, le premier humain à avoir pris ce chemin à sens unique, que tous les autres depuis sont contraints d'accepter. L'introduction de cette rencontre dit notre besoin de nouveaux outils pour nous adresser à des mondes qui aujourd'hui sont à la fois profondément endommagés et redoutablement chaotiques. En effet, si la pandémie actuelle nous a appris quelque chose, c'est à quel point nous sommes mal équipés pour affronter ce qui pourtant est prévu et annoncé. Il me semble que s'il s'agit d'invoquer la force qui dirige ou motive, qui drive les humains que nous sommes, il faut d'abord la penser comme ce qui exigeait de nous que nous ignorions la menace, comme ce qui nous a interdit de faire attention à ce monde devenu radicalement incertain et dangereux. Nous avons besoin d'outils, mais il me semble que nous devons aussi, et peut-être surtout, apprendre à en faire usage autrement, à les libérer de cette compulsion à aller de l'avant qui s'est emparée de nous, apprendre ce que demande leur devenir terrestre, au sens de Bruno Latour. Vu que nous sommes réunis aujourd'hui, tenter d'imaginer la possibilité d'avenir collectif soutenable, qui pourrait catalyser des approches transdisciplinaires et collaboratives, combinant les outils de la science, de la technologie, des arts. Mais suffit-il d'en faire un usage technique de ces outils, d'invoquer la transdisciplinarité, la collaboration? Ces deux vertus traditionnellement définies comme désirables ne me suffisent pas, car elles caractérisent de manière privilégiée des entreprises centrées sur la résolution d'un problème. On peut penser à ce qu'on appelle la conquête de l'espace. On pensera peut-être demain au geoengineering. Or, nous le savons, c'est sans doute précisément à la tentation de considérer ce qui nous arrive sous l'aspect du problème à résoudre qu'il s'agit de résister. Cela demande peut-être une vertu que ne cultivent aujourd'hui ni les sciences, ni l'art, ni la technologie. Cette vertu est la capacité d'accepter d'être situé et obligé par les rapports que nous réussissons à créer avec les autres, humains et non humains. C'est-à-dire de ne pas nous définir nous-mêmes comme posant un problème qui les concerne tous. Cependant, dans la présentation que je commente, un mot m'intéresse très positivement. C'est le mot catalyse. C'est un mot d'origine chimique. J'ai moi-même commencé comme chimiste. La chimie est une science qui n'a jamais pu prétendre à l'innocence. C'est la science des poisons aussi bien que des remèdes. C'est une science qui ne peut non plus prétendre dévoiler une nature soumise à des lois intelligibles. C'est la science des catalyses. Le fait qu'un agent catalytique rende possible une transformation chimique particulière est d'abord un fait empirique. Il y a catalyse. Il y a redistribution de ce que nous définissions comme transformation possible ou impossible. Les chimistes ne rendent pas grâce à leur raison ou à leur méthode, mais à une efficace qu'ils constatent. Les chimistes sont situés par ce qui rend possible leur réussite. Et il ne s'agit plus seulement de chimie aujourd'hui. On assiste en effet à un redevenir empirique de la biologie. Les biologistes héritiers de Lynn Margulis ne sont plus les maîtres des questions qu'il convient d'adresser aux vivants. Ils découvrent à tous les niveaux des enchevêtrements de relations actives qui interdisent d'isoler un vivant, de définir ce dont il serait capable par lui-même. Ils explorent les manières multiples dont les vivants se rendent capables les uns les autres, grâce aux autres, au risque des autres. Et j'en reviens alors à ce qui n'est pas un problème à résoudre, mais une question vitale. De quoi pouvons-nous nous rendre capables grâce à d'autres humains et non humains, voire aussi grâce aux êtres autres qu'humains que nous avons été si fiers de renvoyer à la croyance, grâce à ces autres, avec ces autres, mais aussi au risque de ces autres. Si les arts, les sciences et les technologies sont susceptibles de catalyser les avenirs collectifs soutenables, ce sera, me semble-t-il, si leurs outils acceptent de se laisser situer par cette question vitale, c'est-à-dire aussi acceptent que leur rôle de catalyseur n'est pas simplement de l'ordre d'une proposition plus ou moins théorique adressée à un public amateur, mais est de l'ordre d'une exigence pratique vérifiable à partir de ce que, empiriquement, cet outil contribue à rendre possible. Les anglo-saxons nomment reclaim la capacité collective de tels outils devraient rendre possible. Reclaim, comme régénération, réactivation, se situe dans la perspective d'une réappropriation, non d'un progrès, non d'une marche en avant. Ce dont il s'agit de redevenir capable est ce qui a été cible de destruction systématique et violente partout dans le monde, y compris en Europe, afin que naisse l'individu moderne, isolable, propriétaire de ses propres opinions, poursuivant ses propres intérêts, ayant pour idéal, pour sol, de se réaliser lui-même. Le pari du mouvement de Reclaim est donc anthropologique. L'individu moderne est issu non d'un processus d'émancipation, mais d'un désastre inséparablement social et écologique qui continue aujourd'hui. Il a été séparé de tissus d'interdépendance vitale que, d'une manière ou d'une autre, tous les peuples de la Terre avaient appris comment cultiver. Pour emprunter les termes de Spinoza, le prix de ce que nous avons appelé progrès serait alors un triomphe des passions tristes qui nous isole dans une compétition inquiète, un désir de reconnaissance insatiable que nous-mêmes, académiques et artistes, ne connaissons que trop bien. L'humain moderne se veut autonome, mais est plus dépendant qu'aucun humain ne l'a jamais été. Bénéficiaire irresponsable qui se sent innocent et trouve injuste d'être puni, privé de ce qui lui est dû. Il n'est pas coupable et demande donc qu'on lui garantisse que l'écologie ne sera pas punitive. Mais les activistes d'aujourd'hui ne sont pas, comme on les en accuse, des moralistes punitifs. Ils veulent plus d'autre chose. S'ils ont besoin d'outils, ceux-ci devront participer à la culture de dispositifs dont l'efficace serait catalytique. Des dispositifs qui donnent à une situation le pouvoir de faire penser ceux et celles qui concernent, de les rendre capables d'imaginer et agir ensemble, de faire sens en commun. La réussite de ces dispositifs est marquée par ce que Spinoza appelait la joie, ce qui accompagne toute augmentation de la puissance d'agir, c'est-à-dire aussi de sentir et d'imaginer. Une telle joie n'a rien de psychologique, elle est vitale, générée par l'expérience d'une transformation qui s'est faite avec d'autres, grâce à d'autres, au risque des autres. La poétesse Audre Lorde a écrit que jamais l'outil du maître ne démantèlera la maison du maître. Quelles que soient les bonnes intentions de celui ou celle qui l'a conçu, cet outil. Les concepteurs des outils dont nous avons besoin pour catalyser effectivement la génération de puissance d'agir et de sentir me semblent devoir apprendre à diagnostiquer dans leur pratique ce qui porte la marque du maître. Et d'abord peut-être la notion moderne et abstraite de public. Leurs outils doivent avoir pour réussite de devenir partie prenante d'une situation concrète, une source de tension intriquée, et demandent à être évalués de manière empirique, c'est-à-dire dans les termes immanents aux exigences de cette situation. C'est là ce que j'appellerais un engagement terrestre. Un engagement qui, comme l'a écrit Donna Haraway, prend parti pour certaines manières de vivre et de mourir contre d'autres. Un tel engagement ne vise pas un idéal politique qui devrait conduire, drive encore une fois, les humains. Il a plutôt pour enjeu ce qu'on peut appeler une infrapolitique, comme on parle d'infrastructure. Les rapports d'interdépendance entre les vivants sont l'infrastructure qui a rendu possible la multiplicité des manières d'être vivants et agissants qui peuplent la Terre. Il s'agit de participer à la régénération de ces rapports que la modernité a rendus stériles, d'activer leur capacité à nourrir les luttes et les expérimentations sans lesquelles il n'y aura pas d'avenir digne de ce nom. Je vous remercie.
Everyone to the knowledge panel. I will quickly introduce the theme and then the panelists and myself. Is our conception of knowledge outdated, part of the analog era, and needs to be revised and refreshed? Do binaries between intelligence and ignorance need nuancing and complexifying? How can we problematize knowledge? How can we think beyond traditional categories or understandings of how we know? Through what bodily or mental mechanisms do we know? What does it mean to be a knower? To share knowledge? And what material or social forms need to be reconsidered for altering our knowledge landscape? Today, we will be exploring these themes and seeking to retool the language frames around terms like knowledge, thinking, and consciousness. My name is Michael Kaethler. I'm a postdoc researcher at KU Leuven in the Department of Architecture. And I have the great honor of introducing Indy Johar and Sarat Maharaj today, with whom we will be discussing these very fascinating and quite provocative questions related to knowledge. I'm going to give a very brief introduction to each of them. Indy is an architect, co-founder of Project 00, and most recently Dark Matter Labs. Indy has co-founded multiple social ventures from Impact Hub Westminster to Impact Hub Birmingham, along with working with large global multinationals and institutions to support their transition to a positive systems economy. And he's taught in multiple universities and institutions around the world. Sarat, with us, is a professor of visual art and knowledge systems at Lund University and Malmö Art Academy in Sweden, as well as a research professor at Goldsmiths in London, with a specialization in the works of Richard Hamilton, Marcel Duchamp, James Joyce, amongst others. He's also involved in curating with events such as Documenta 11, the Sao Paulo Biennial in 2010, and Guangzhou in the Triennial in 2008, and many more. For those who would like more info on our panelists, please check out the Telegram group where the full bio is posted. Moreover, if you're not already part of the Telegram group, I strongly encourage you to join. There's already there's been some really amazing discussions over the last 2 days there, and so I would assume that will follow with this exciting panel. So please do join us. And to get going for this panel, I'm going to ask a kind of short to the point question in order to elicit a kind of short to the point answer to position our two panelists on the theme of knowledge. So here, focusing on our current and future social, ecological, human crises, and we're on a panel on knowledge. Why do we need a panel on knowledge? Is there a knowledge crisis? Indy, can we start with you?
Yeah, it's a nice, lovely to start with a lovely, easy question. Good afternoon. I think it's worth talking about this subject. I think it's an important subject for us to reflect on. I think there are several key components, sort of issues to start with. One is we often talk about knowledge and intelligence and knowledge societies, 2001, all this kind of language was around. But in an emergent, complex world, is the ossification of knowledge or the kind of commodification of knowledge the issue? And I wonder whether this is kind of part of a way of seeing the world by segmenting it into a series of commodities, whereas actually in an entangled world, in a small, entangled and complex emergent world, is the abstraction and commodification of knowledge itself the problem and is part of a thesis. Second, I think who is the subject in this knowledge story? I think that's also really key. The latent subject is either theoretically humans or a human, or humans or human systems. And I think what's kind of interesting is to sort of transcend that thesis and sort of talk about, in a way, what if we were to perceive the world, and again, it's Sunday afternoon, so we can go slightly philosophical, but if the subject is kind of the consciousness of the planet rather than human consciousness or human systems or human endeavor. So I think the question is important, and I think if we're going to explore the thesis of how we are human in the 21st century, I think this is a fundamental commodity issue problem that we need to analyze and reconstruct into a new thesis. And I think it's part of the strategic problem, in a way, the thesis on knowledge as we've constructed it. So I'll stop there, but I think that's a key issue. Yes.
Great, thank you, Sarat.
Yes, thank you, Indy. That's a very interesting and perceptive answer. I wish I could respond more directly to that. But I will say, in answering Michael's question about, is there a crisis? Yes, to the extent that we claim to be a knowledge society, this claim has become so commonplace and so much part of everyday language. But what exactly do we mean by this? And knowledge society, the knowledge economy, the knowledge everyday world has been essentially reduced to smart infrastructures and the smartness of our activity organized and placed in particular regimes of input and output. I think this is one side of the knowledge society that interests me, that it claims to be a know-all society, that it has taken over and governed and organized and administered almost every domain of everyday life today. Things that are left out are being drawn into its gravitational pull to be organized as knowledge. But what kind of knowledge? What sort of knowledge? So there is what I call a Pan-Sophic society. A Pan-Sophic society, by which I mean that the claims to knowing and knowledge and being in knowledge, and Sophic has that element, the charge of being a society that's wise to itself, wisdom, and that it's a pan event. It's a universal kind of condition. I question whether it is universal and wise, because what we have seen in the knowledge society, and perhaps our pandemic today has highlighted and illuminated the thing, is the authority of the scientific method, that this has ascended with the ascendancy of algorithmic thinking. So these two elements I would take up and draw out of the notion of knowledge society today in its crisis, to bring it under scrutiny, to bring it under some sort of question, to say, well, if the methodology of science is so highly regarded and to some extent glorified, it's quite interesting when we see the media today and our journalists and our politicians constantly claiming that they have the authority of science behind the particular policies and the particular strategies they're offering to society to deal with the viral cloud, and that these, in fact, are very different voices we hear from science itself. Science has different models, different voices, different arguments, different perspectives, and of course there's also personal rivalries between schools in the sciences, but nevertheless they are presented as a unified, authenticating kind of center from which everything else is to be judged and examined. But what does it leave out? What is the unsystematic, chaotic, open-ended areas of mental activity and dimensions of consciousness which are increasingly swept to the margins and seen as mumbo-jumbo and seen as completely delegitimated? So for me, that is the element of crisis that I'm interested in.
Okay, great, thank you. It's a nice, strong start off. Now, both of you have elaborated on a notion of knowledge which seems to be in need of an update, for lack of better term, and which makes me feel almost that how we conceive of knowledge today is simply outdated for our needs, one, for our tools. We are stuck in what might be described as the analog knowledge world, in which Indy, you once described as being kind of defined by separation, dominion, and control. If you agree that knowledge does need to be updated, or at least that our knowledge currently is out of date, what should come next? What is the natural successor, or at least what is the desired successor to our existing knowledge system, which is, as Sarat said, perhaps overly artificially tight and closed, and as Indy was saying, perhaps simply too abstract? Jump in.
Well, I'm happy to sort of jump in. I think the problem of knowledge cannot be answered through, it's the question that it sets up is problematic, because I think the problem starts somewhere else. So I think the problem starts and I think this is why this festival is really critical, in a redescription of what it means to be human. And only in a redescription of describing what it means to be human do we redefine our relationship and our abstraction or our comprehension of the world. And our relationship with the world. So I would say we may find knowledge is an architecture of a machined comprehension of the world, where, yes, as you rightly said, it's attachment, dominion, and control using knowledge and information. And it doesn't take account of, and all of that worldview requires a kind of almost a quasi-scientific method as a linear thesis of the world, which actually doesn't take account, as Sarat was rightly saying, of actually our new comprehensions of reality. So I think knowledge itself is a kind of a sort of a symptom point of failure, but not necessarily the place to start renewing the conversation, I would argue. I think the renewal of the conversation starts at a much deeper root, at the question of what it means to be human, and redefining our relationship as much more entangled and embedded rather than detached. And that thesis then opens up a completely different thesis of relationship to being recognizing humans as a multitude, recognizing humans as an interdependent relationship, recognizing interdependence in space and time. It builds within it a different thesis of consciousness, not of individuals, but actually a quite interdependent consciousness. And that, I think, opens up a whole new paradigm of to be in knowledge, and I'm not even sure knowledge, I would tend to prefer the word of being in practice or to being in relationship with, rather than actually to be knowledgeable, which is the act of consumption and storage, which I think is again this idea of isolation and siloism as a language structure. So it reconstructs, I think it's a great problem description, but I think if we follow it through, it won't give us a paradigm space to actually open up and dissect the question. And my intuition is we have to start exactly with this festival starting to kick off, is to actually open up this conversation from the paradigm of reimagining our consciousness. And I think in that paradigm, more and more what's, the kind of line of arc that I'm very intrigued by is this thesis of, if we are the spark of a planetary consciousness, and the planetary consciousness, and I think that's a carbon and silicon hybrid, by the way. So this is not some romantic, I think it's a carbon silicon hybrid planetary consciousness that we're growing, we're part of, and that itself is a spark of consciousness in the universe. And this is an emergent force of nature in itself. We are an emergent realization in nature itself. And that questions ourselves as individuals, as sovereignty, all of those things start to be questioned. And that I think that's where we have to start. And I think, and as Sarat in our previous conversation was very elegantly speaking about how, if you look back in the 1960s, quantum physics philosophers, they were all talking to quantum physics scientists, they were all talking to the philosophers and Eastern philosophers, talking about how to discover new language and frames. And David Bohm and all those guys were all in conversation, because I think this requires a different thesis of our relationship to the world. And that opens up the future. And I think so. Knowledge itself is a great problem descriptor, but I don't think it's a pathway to get into the story. And the pathway has to be redefining ourselves. And I think we're in the middle of that, by the way. So I'll come, and I think that redefinition is not just to ourselves, it's also our redefinition with each other, redefinition with the future, which I think is still about control and consumption and colonialization, our relationship with things, which is about ownership and enslavement, our relationship with nature, which is again about resource and extraction. So it's a foundational transition of all those things, and where we use knowledge as a thesis as to empower our mechanisms of control rather than to be in treaty with. I think there's something much more critical to be done. And again, I think we're at the beginning. We're at the beginning of that story. I think there's many other greater people like Sarat and other people who are thinking harder around that part of the story.
Okay, great. Thank you, Indy. Okay, Sarat, would you also like to respond?
Yes, I could only add, I suppose, footnotes to what Indy has said with regard to this. I think it's important to stress that in speaking of knowledge, we do take into account historical developments. We don't have this notion of a primordial thing called knowledge that we are reclaiming down the ages, or that there is something like the perennial philosophy that we are claiming. I think our historical circumstances shape the understanding of knowledge. Today, the idea of something being knowledge or pseudo-knowledge, knowledge or science or pseudoscience, as was the big central debate in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, which comes to an end by the 60s, when there is the end of that kind of certitude that we know how to draw the line between, and I have, of course, in mind here, thinkers like Isabelle Stengers, who we have on this group, and Ilya Prigogine, and at the end of this certitude that comes with the 60s and 70s, does open us to all kinds of thinking that once again we're called New Age thinking or simply sentimental spiritualism from if we take the design for living that opens the post-war era in Britain. The design for living was an attempt to redesign every aspect of life, from housing right through to the way one dressed and the way one walked and the way one held oneself in social contexts, the way one spoke. A new way of speaking English was also designed for the post-war period, more democratic, or as it was put in the language of the time, more meritocratic forms of pronunciation. So from that, we arrive in the 60s with something like the design for dying by Leary. And I think in that, Leary speaks of the limited nature of logic, of the very possibility of what a post-biological definition of the human might be, how we might rethink what we mean by the human and not be caught up in ideas of the human which are essentially humanistic, that is, come down from Renaissance thinking and post-Renaissance thinking from areas of Protestantism and the Reformation, which questioned the old world of Catholicism, that the Reformation thinking produces the notion that the human is sovereign in the world, that the human is the custodian of nature, that we are in charge of reality, and that this, I think, still hangs on today when we speak of saving the world, of saving, of being the saviors of the ecological crisis that faces us. We see ourselves essentially as central to the drama of the planet and the universe, when in fact we have to take on board a far more a role that's far more marginal than the one we have given ourselves over the last 500 years, which also fueled colonialism, which fueled notions of building empires over other civilizations. I'm talking of Eurocentric notions of sovereignty and the sovereign human. So that would be central to questioning, how do we know? How do we get away from this idea that knowledge is just an accumulation of truths held somewhere in a mega archive, back to the notion that knowledge is a series of practices, it's a spectrum of activities, of being in the world, of engaging with others, of interacting, and that this covers a spectrum of activities, that of course at one end we have the knowledge experts and the specialists, but as we do know, even experts have to be questioned and put under scrutiny. And this happens when we stop seeing knowledge as only something produced at the rarefied and elevated levels of certain disciplines, rather than as something that is part of our everyday interaction with the world and is centered in immersive experience, as it were, and emerges from that. And that means that we have to rethink the supreme place we have given to the intellect and to mentalist definitions of the human, and move to broader notions of consciousness, and to also take on board the non-cognitive dimensions of being in the world. That, I think, perhaps reminds us partly of our animal and plant connections, and also then makes us redefine how we interact with those worlds of the animal and the non-human, as it were.
Okay, so then I'm going to follow up to both of you, because I find it interesting how you are speaking quite in parallel with each other in terms of moving beyond our existing knowledge framework. But practically speaking, I mean, Sarat, you're an educator. Indy, you're involved in a range of institutions, reshaping public and institutional discourse. How, if we cannot think ourselves out of a knowledge framework, then how do we, because if thinking is part of the problem, we cannot therefore think our way out. How do we shift to this new, let's say, kind of relational way of being, this new consciousness? How do we practically get there? Either of you can jump in.
I hope I'm not speaking too much and hogging, as it were. The idea for me, of course, looking at the academy, looking at the university, is a very empirical, very concrete situation in which these questions emerge. So I would say that it goes right down to what we mean by education, by teaching, and I would move away from the notion of teaching and lecturing to students. I would begin to think that the gathering is about a joint learning, the production of a joint expertise. It's not about handing over organized expertise. This is why I would hold on to the term knowledge production, as opposed to what is current in our institutions, which is knowledge transfer, where we see something that is already established, already polished and received, and all that we as people involved as teachers, lecturers, tutors have to do is to hand over and to supervise the handling. The language already suggests a certain kind of hierarchical relationship, rather than a productive, creative one in which we might be totally surprised at the source from which new knowledge begins to emerge and is produced when we think of it as a situation of joint learning, when we think of it as coming together and sharing insight, understanding, experience, and building out the problematics of knowledge from that. So I do see it in slightly more modest terms, though the question might have been posed in very grand terms of consciousness and what have you. But in dealing with the situation, I would say one is speaking of situations of learning. One is speaking of places of learning. And these might be, again, both in the within the walls of the university and completely outside it. And that is why, for me, art and art practice is so important, that it is a way of learning in which there is no protocol, or at least with contemporary art, that unlike the laboratory, though we have in many ways rather plundered the language of science and called ourselves as art laboratories and knowledge laboratories in the world of art, but unlike the laboratory, or maybe we're talking about a laboratory at such an elevated level where there is no given protocol, where creativity flourishes because we are in a state of what I call cluelessness, a state of ignorance. We don't know what question will be produced. We have to learn how to produce the question by being together and sharing this insight together. And so the state of cluelessness, which is so derided in society as a whole, is for me one of the most creative situations to be in.
Okay, great. Indy, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in terms of trying to make this kind of land, I think this manifests in lots of things. So this kind of discourse, while seeming rarefied, it manifests in a very simple idea of property rights. So a property right is about effectively the kind of the monopolized control and assessment of an area for your utility. It's a relationship structure firmly embedded into it. So it's also about how you construct the dominion of that control in terms of GIS property maps or GIS-based property maps, or all the way through to various other things. So for me, it's manifesting in these institutional architectures. So the employment contract is another one, which constructs a relationship of power and authority and the predication of role. So I will define the role the other person will play. That is a relationship of construction of power and comprehension of the third party. So you can then just, I mean, these are just two, you can then start manifesting them all the way through. So I would say pretty much all of our relationships, whether it's actually the value of a tree, the value of a tree is abstracted into the value of timber, as opposed to the complex interdependencies of the whole system's value of a tree itself. And that's to do with the abstraction of knowledge and the efficacy of what we can abstract as knowledge and commodify in that process. So I think we can talk about this as in a rarefied sense, but actually this manifests practically in, in cities like Sheffield, who cut down all their trees because their accounting infrastructure, their knowledge infrastructure, did not perceive the value, environmental value of trees, but could see the costs of trees. So the frameworks of knowledge, which are so reductive and micro, are actually destroying our comprehension of the actual real world utility, real world comprehension and relational value of that entity. So I think this can feel a philosophical argument, but it's not. It's actually a deeply practical argument about how we construct our relationships with the world. So I mean, these are just examples that we're working on, all the way through to James Scott's kind of seeing like a state, which constructs a whole thesis of dominion and power and mechanisms. So how we take measurement, and that itself is a mechanism of knowledge formation, which thereby creates power and utility and understanding in a very particular way. So I don't see these as philosophical discourses. I see these as kind of practical philosophical discourses that manifest in actual actions. And these actions are now critical. I suppose that's the point I want to get to, is that I don't think these are, I think we are in the midst of a fundamental transition. You know, climate change is not about CO2, right? Let's just, you know, climate change is a fundamental failure in our relationship with the world, right? That's what's at the root of it. It's not CO2. You fix CO2, we still die as a species. It is about our relationship failure. And the relationship failure is fundamentally our relationship with the world. And that's why I say this is a deep transition. We're in the midst of a deep transition, as we were at the edge of kind of when people were like, you know, Newton himself was a polymathic thinker, but he constructed the basis of a very particular worldview that then stretched out to a very linear model of thinking. We've reduced our polymathic thinking capacity to very simple points. So I think we're in the moment where effectively we have to reimagine actually our relationship with the world very much to how we constructed it in history. And I think that relationship has been building since the 1960s. We have, you know, the scientific understanding, the human understanding, all the way through to actually our technological infrastructures. These have all been evolving to challenge the siloed model of thinking. So I mean, just to put that there, we should probably carry on with the next question, but I think it's really practical.
No, I think it's very interesting. And for those who aren't familiar with Indy's work, I would encourage you to take a look at some of his descriptions of decoding these underlying systems which have these ongoing effects and how we relate to the world, which Indy's touching on now. Now, I think we're kind of running a little bit low on time, so I'd like to ask a final question. This is kind of the philosophical ending, perhaps. You know, both of you flag these kind of ethical responsibilities related to knowledge, and by virtue of that also being a knower, someone perhaps, or maybe using the language of Indy, being conscious or being in relation to others, also relating to Sarat's work. But what does it mean to know today, and what will it mean in the future? Or what does it mean to be a knower, and what will that mean in the future? So it's the grand vision I'm hoping for, to kind of leave off with a philosophical hook for our audience. Sarat, what do you like to say? Would you like to start?
Well, of course, it is a classic question. Who is the knower, and what is the object of knowing? I think maybe the poets have answered this. If we take Yeats's famous line from his late Sanskrit-oriented poetry, who can tell the dancer from the dance? And that echoes from ancient Indian thought in the philosophical systems of India, one of the 6 ancient philosophical systems. Who can tell the knower from the field of knowing? Kshetra, Kshetragyan. Who could say who is the one who captures the field of knowledge? And this immersive element, this element that you cannot really ultimately in the true act of knowing something, draw a distinction between subject and object, that these begin to give us a field in which we dissolve ourselves or are dissolved, might again seem a little bit remote, but I think is an important, sobering reminder that our notion of the sovereign knower, who then decides to know a particular thing in a particular way, this might have its own beauty, that you know it in the way of a dissection, you know it in the way of an analytical cut-up of the object, you know it in the way of breaking it into fragments, parts, particles. But in the longer run, that is not a holistic way of knowing. And maybe this is what we still aim for in speaking of the knower and the field of knowing, or the object of knowing, dissolving into a state of being in the know rather than the knower, which suggests all the elements of hierarchy, control, and, as it were, primacy.
Great. Thank you, Sarat. Very nice. Indy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I can do that much better than add some footnotes to that one. I think that's absolutely right. And I think that in a way, the question articulates the problem that we face, is that our language structures are still locked into object orientation, subject-object differentiation perspectives. So, you know, the English language, which we're having this conversation with, is 80% constructed out of nouns and object-oriented worldviews. So what we've got is a language which is still trying to bridge into a new thesis. And I think that's where our fundamental failures are. I mean, the one thing I would suggest is, and again, probably cutting a fine line, is it an act of becoming or being? And I'm sort of probably sitting on the becoming line a little bit, of becoming into knowledge, as in it is a continuous unfolding field, as opposed to it ever being resulting in that. So I think the real question at the center of it is how do we question, for me, for my personal challenge, is how do we resolve the thesis of sovereign interdependencies and the kind of becoming of interdependent, and that being in that the being in interdependence and what that requires, and the consciousness and behaviors that requires. And I think in that result probably is the thesis which has the implicate order of resolving that question. So I can point out where the source truth might be, but I don't know it.
That's interesting. That's nice. I mean, I really like the language that Sarat used in an interview going back to 2004 with Daniel Birnbaum about to know the other is to melt your intellectual frame. And there's something really beautiful also in just seeing knowledge as a form of becoming. It means limiting the self in many ways, especially one's sovereignty or dominion over other objects, species, and so forth. So thank you. Great. Are we moving on to Q&A now, or should I?
It's about time, yeah. Let's go there.
Great.
So first of all, I want to say that I think some people had issues with the live stream. And if you couldn't follow the session, I'd like to apologize and assure you that it will be made available as a recording. And I have to say it is really worth watching again, even if you have seen it. I'm also happy to say that Michael and Indy will both join us on the Telegram right after the session, so you can also talk to them there. And then Michael, I just wanted to say that I really love your voice and the kind of attention you gave to the session. I felt in such good hands in your panel and in the presence of your thoughts, Indy and Sarat. And now let's take some questions from the Telegram stream. There was one question around the question of decolonization. So that there is an obvious need for decolonization of knowledge, and there's much talk about that. But what would that actually mean in your terms, and how would we get there? I think this is probably for both of you.
If I may, Michael.
Please.
I don't.
Go ahead, Sarat.
Oh, right. Yes, I think it's a crucial question, but we shouldn't see the question of decolonization as simply a contemporary question. This has come up again and again in the history of thought and ideas and knowledge. We have one way of thinking of it in the earlier part of the 20th century, and then a second way of thinking of it through the experiences of articulated in the work of, say, someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, and the African American experience, but not seen only as the African American experience, but he connected it to the rise of the darker continents, as he put it, the rise of the colonized world. And that was one model of seeing what it could mean to look at the other side of consciousness beyond the Eurocentric. And in his famous work, Dark Princess, Africa, Asia, the Dark Princess of India, and the African and Asian participants in this getting together, and the African American Matthew Town come together and learn how to overcome the various forms of identification given to them in the colonial and imperial world in which they have grown up. Then there is a third phase where we arrive at post-colonial thinking, which comes after the colonial world had found independence. And it meant decolonization, meant political independence of sorts, but it did not entirely mean mental decolonization. And perhaps today we are stressing that dimension of decolonial thought, though this is much more of a Mediterranean Lusophonic concept coming from Southern Europe and the Portuguese, Spanish-speaking worlds of the Southern Hemisphere. But in its generalized form, it has come to stand for taking apart those elements of the mind and those elements of thinking and those elements of knowledge that we find hold us back. These are mind-forged manacles, to use Blake's famous phrase. The point is that how do we do it when we are, as Indy has pointed out to us, when we are using a language which is in itself a language that has promoted a kind of colonized thinking. So here maybe we turn once again to new inventions around the English language, in creolite, in the language that is produced in the mix of indigenous languages with English, with colonial English, and the production of a new way of thinking that comes out of creolized language, or what for me, a bit more radical than the creolized state of things, is a pidginized language, that the moment of pidgin is the most burning moment of meltdown of old perspectives and frameworks of thinking for new ones to emerge. Or indeed, we might, looking from within English, look at thinkers such as James Joyce, who said he would dissolve the English language till it was totally unrecognizable as English. And it would keep the professors busy for 100 years until, of course, we had produced the truly decolonized language of the future. How is that to be produced is still a question. But yes, the whole question of knowledge takes us immediately into the issue of its decolonization of its categories, concepts, modes of conceptualization, and then modes of expression.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Very interesting. I'm not sure if there are more questions, but I thought I'd just turn this to Indy quickly. With, like, to envision, well, we're talking about decolonizing knowledge. So much of the Western knowledge or colonial project or program has been related to reason, scientific rigor, and so forth. And I would be very interested in how you interpret whether or how reason or rationality can fit within consciousness. Because the way you described knowledge as being in relationality, where is reason and rationality there?
Yeah, so I mean, I mean, firstly, just an amazing answer by Sarat, and I suppose for the purposes of this talk, what if we didn't talk about decolonization, but going beyond colonization? And the reason why that's important is that I think one of the things of decolonizing is to assume there was something better prior, right? And actually, I think what we will see is additive colonization pretty much throughout history in all parts of the world. So colonization, which is the thesis of control, we have been continuously in an act of colonizing. And whether it's empires in Asia, or whether it's other empires of thought and control in other places, the number zero was not constructed in Europe, it was constructed, the abstraction was constructed in the Middle East. So I wonder whether one of the problems is in the construction of the debate or the discourse is problematizing the past and thereby putting us into tension with our own existence. Actually, whereas maybe another way is to recognize all the errors of history, but recognizing what we always have to do is recognize that as a human species, we have got to a point and now we need to go to another relationship with the world. And I wonder whether in a philosophical sense, we've been captured by the activists. And actually we need a different language, which is purposeful and interventional, recognizing the violence of history that's been perpetuated all over the world, and whether we need a different thesis. And that's why I think colonization for me is not a discourse just about Western theory and Western practice. Colonization is a thesis of power and the abstraction of power and its relationship with the world. And I think what we're now really, that's why I go back to slightly boringly my point about it's the reconfiguration of our relationship with the world that allows us to move beyond colonization as a thesis of organizing. And it allows us to move forward on a together path. And I think we wouldn't have got to this path without the attraction that we did. So this is the point. I think we're not getting rid of rational thought. I think rational thought has its role. It sits in a framework of a broader thought. And I think that it's a complementary nature of that I think is critical. And that interdependence and our being able to see all the other dimensions of being is vital, not just the singularity of designing our institutions to amplify a single component of being human. So for example, humo-economist economic theory is largely constructed on the idea of humans as self-interested actors that can be externally, extrinsically motivated through financial gain. We know this is actually not true in any of the sociological studies that are done, but that has become the mechanism of organizing our institutional economy and thereby rarefying a component, one micro-dimension component of humanity, and extrapolating it into the macro incentive system. And that thereby creates all the colonization powers, structures, and everything else, or one aspect of it, not all of it. So I suppose I want to challenge the thesis of maybe decolonization is problematizing us in a way, rather than recognizing this as a phase transition of humanity to a thesis of a new relationship with the world, rather than actually trying to problematize our own histories, which leaves us vulnerable to nothing. It leaves us with nothing to grab hold of. But actually, we have to recognize and move forward. Sarat, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, that's true. And I think that's very important that we see it as a project that's leading into a future rather than simply a chipping away at past oppressions, as it were, important as that is, because I think it leads us to perhaps come back to what Michael said, that if rationality is totally associated with the Western project, what kind of rationality was that? And are we therefore speaking of an expanded, almost an alternative rationality that begins to emerge? I think this has been debated in quite a few circumstances. I do know with my colleague, my late colleague, Ulrich Beck in Munich, this was a major question. Is there an expanded rationality, a new rationality that we have to develop? If we take a thinker like Achille Mbembe in Johannesburg, then Achille Mbembe is speaking of délire, the idea of a kind of surrealist madness that the Western world might have put onto African ways of thinking, seeing it as, well, they're crazy, they're thinking in a crazy way. But is this associative way of thinking not already a kind of sort of preliminary new rationality that we have to rethink, that we shouldn't dismiss as just superstitious ways of thinking in which imagistic lines are drawn up or sequences are drawn up? And the idea that rationality is somehow purely a Western thing is also part of the colonial, and this is why we have to think back in history too, is part of the demotion of the big systems in, say, Indian philosophy, which were highly rational in their ways of arguing, in the forms of logic, in fact, far more subtle systems of logic, which went beyond Greek syllogistic thinking. And that has been well discussed in philosophical circles. I don't want to get too rarefied about this issue, but from these bodies of evidence, Achille Mbembe, Indian thinking, and the fact that creolization itself is a futuristic production, is about emergent forms of consciousness rather than simply grievances about the past. It's not about the past only. I think all of that shows that there is a model of an expanded rationality that we can quite legitimately ponder and examine in other practices, or practices that we set up, what I call in the joint learning situations and strategies that we consider.
Can I just say on that the rationality itself, we often see rationality as a function of the individual, whereas I think what all the research is telling us is rationality is also a function of context. So it's not an isolatable act. So you put people in an economic recession, they will make different rational choices to if you put them in a different context. So there's a contextual contingent component to rationality, which is often disregarded. And I love your term about a broader sort of fuller thesis of rationality, which I think is a really key point. Sorry, Julian and Michael.
That's all right. I have the unfortunate task of cutting the conversation short now that it is really going. I will definitely watch back that last part of the conversation. It was really fascinating. So thank you, Sarat, Indy, and Michael. And I want to do something a bit unconventional because there are a few more great questions, and I suggest that we take them into the Telegram chat. So there was this question, if you no longer prioritize learning in formalized institutions, but instead take seriously every day as a moment of learning, where does it leave the university and the lab, or the museums for that matter? So I suggest we leave that question and take it into the discussion in the Telegram chat, and where I'm sure this conversation will continue. So I would like to thank you one more time, and please stay with me in the Zoom until we get permission to leave. And with that, we will conclude this session with the film Mermaids, or Aden in Wonderland by the Caribbean Collective. And after the screening, we will have a long break to grab some food before we continue with Access. Thank you very much.
Thank you.